Hey, welcome everyone. Today we have a special guest, Lisa Martinez. She is the Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer at Lee Health. And our topic today unifies two important things, which is advancing your career with embracing fearless authenticity, which is something that she's been doing in many different ways. Authenticity and fearlessness in both speaking up about opportunities that you want for your career advancements, but also sharing your opinions, asking questions, advocating for yourself and for others, and even disagreeing. So, welcome, Lisa. So excited to have you here today.
I'm excited too. Really looking forward to our conversation. It's a topic I'm passionate about, so this will be great.
Yeah, wonderful. One of the things that we all experience at some point is we don't always feel that fearless sometimes. And a very common emotion is feeling intimidated or when we're in a room and we're scared of sharing our thoughts. Has that ever happened to you?
Oh, absolutely. I think part of why I embrace fearlessness so much is because I was so fearful as a child. I was super shy and introverted, and some of that extended into early in my career, where I would be intimidated by more senior level people or technical experts in my organization. And in meetings, I would put a lot of pressure on myself to make, oh, you need to make this really brilliant point. You don't want to look stupid. You don't want to be humiliated. And I would get feedback from mentors and leaders at the time to speak up. You have a lot of great things to say. And so they encouraged me to speak up, and I would. But for me, really the turning point was when I realized that everything changed for me when I realized that intimidation was my own personal problem. It wasn't that other people were intimidating me by their body language, their personality, the things that they were saying. It was that I was allowing my insecurities in that moment to hold me back, to shut me down. And so when I realized it's something that I had within my control to overcome, like I said, it changed everything. So I started to get curious. Okay, my adrenaline's going, I'm feeling nervous. What's going on inside of me that's making me react in this way in this moment? And what are my thoughts? And so as we started to engage in conversation, and I started to pick up on cues and realizing that I'm reacting to this individual's maybe expertise, or maybe I'm overly sensitive to an eye roll or frustration, and realizing hold your ground in that moment, get curious, know that it's okay to feel a little nervous, but connect with that individual, right? Connect and get curious about why they're reacting in the way that they're reacting. And I've had those moments where someone, their body language, oh, you look concerned. Tell me about that face. I can't read it. It seems like you have a different point of view, and that's fine. So I think it really helped me in those moments to be more forgiving of my nervousness, but also to recognize that I had everything in me to overcome that sense of intimidation.
I like that you turned to yourself and you had the attitude of, oh, curiosity. I wanted to understand what's going on with me, and I want to understand how this is reflecting in the environment. And that's part of knowing yourself and being authentic, right? Knowing who you are and how you respond to the situation, and adapting to in a way that works for yourself and for others in that moment. And you talked about having a situation where someone made a comment about you, and then you said, okay, what's that face? Tell me more about that, because I think a lot of us experience situations where people are either making assumptions that they don't like something that we said or we do, and we don't quite know how to respond to that. And then we retrieve and we start to build all these stories up in our head about, oh, what do they mean by that face? Or what do they mean by that body language? Do they not like me? Are they trying to say that they want to fire me? Like, how did that go on for you? How did you decide what to do in that moment to clarify the situation and see what you needed to do next, given the intimidation was there?
It's for me, it's knowing my strengths And I really love building connections with people. So my number one Clifton strength is relator. And that's all about, in my view, connection, building personal relationships, even friendships at work. So I like deep relationships. I like people to share who they authentically are. So I've been in strategy for a long time. And for those strategists in the audience or those who interact with us, sometimes we're accused of speaking in jargon, consultant speak. What are you talking about? And not being maybe practical. So I'm used to that look sometimes of, what are you talking about? And so in those moments, it used to intimidate me because I would think, oh my goodness, they think I'm useless, that I'm using jargon, and then these are empty words. So it's in those moments where I realize I need to keep it simple. Keep it simple, keep it relatable, keep it practical. And when you want to make sure you don't rely so much on presentations, PowerPoints, and because I think what PowerPoints do is distract you from your audience, right? You're not looking eye to eye. And I learned that pretty earlier in my career, which is build a connection with your audience, look them in the eye, and that allows you in those moments to respond to the body language, to get real-time feedback, whether it's verbal or nonverbal, real-time feedback on is what I'm saying resonating with this person. And being open to, it's interesting, I've met with different team members throughout the healthcare system. And just this week, and I've been asked multiple times, hey, what's your role? What does strategy and innovation do? And I'm still figuring out how to communicate it in a way that it resonates with someone. And the first couple of times, we help the organization anticipate the future and make some changes and think about our future direction and make the right choices today. And I still don't get it. And then this week, we're all about helping us be competitive. And I think people understand that, being the health system of choice in our community and the ways we can do that and serve our patients and our team members. And so it's still practicing, right? It's practicing that pitch of what you do in a way that will resonate with people and build that connection. And for me, it's all about that connection and building relationships. And you can't do that if you're hiding behind a PowerPoint and jargon and it's all about you. It's not about what that person's questions and curiosities and challenges are.
Yeah, so connection is key. So you're saying connection both when you're trying to share an idea with others, but as well as when people challenge you, having that connection also helps bridge that gap in either of those scenarios. And I like that you're looking for ways to explain what you do. I imagine that for your children or your parents, people who often are disconnected really with what strategy means and have never worked in the corporate environment, that would be a really interesting test of getting the messaging right in a way that people understand. And when it comes to knowing yourself, right? And it's so important to know ourselves. You already mentioned a few things. You mentioned that you discovered that you were a relator, and that was something important for you in the way you lead and in the way you work. And you also mentioned that you looked inwards and you were curious about yourself to figure out how to overcome that challenge of feeling intimidated. So you've already been working on yourself. Are there other ways in which you develop that knowledge about yourself, and what have you discovered about yourself over time?
It's interesting. There's lots of tools out there, Myers-Briggs and DISC, a lot of ways to assess yourself and how you show up in relationships and in work environments. I mentioned strength finders because I think I like operating from a place of strength. And I know that, and I've learned that strengths can also be overdone and become weaknesses. So it's a double-edged sword there. And what I enjoy, and my team has done this, we've done the assessment of strength finders, because when you're most passionate about something, you're going to really excel because you're going to be passionate enough to build that skill. And I think it creates, I would say, common language in teams. Like, I'm a relator, I'm a learner, I'm an arranger, right? These are mine. Intellection. So I love intellectual conversations. I love learning. I love connection. I have this one, and the maximizer is all about excellence and how I can rise to that level of excellence and bring my team and organizations along. It all makes sense. And then I'll talk with a team member and they could have very different ones, but you could see how it all contributes to building a really great team. I think it's an excellent tool. Another one that I thought was really insightful, and for me, it was really illuminating to take that one because it really, really helped me understand what the things I valued and my fears. And in fact, I have a little post-it on my monitor that I have. No one wants to feel insignificant, incompetent, or unlikable. And when I'm feeling defensive, it's likely because I'm feeling one of those things, or when I'm triggering defensiveness in somebody else, in those moments where I might feel intimidated because maybe someone's not really involved in the conversation and engaging in the conversation. Maybe they're stepping away, or maybe there's some conflict there that's getting heightened. It's likely that I've triggered one of those feelings. And so what I learned through the assessment and some introspection was my greatest fear was actually around incompetence and being humiliated. And that's ever since, and I realized, wow, I've been that way for a really long time. And that's what's kept me quiet and introverted. Now that I'm more vocal, I realize, oh, be careful. If you're feeling defensive, it's likely that someone's triggering that sense that, hey, you're not competent. And when you're coming into organizations where you bring a skill, but you may not know that industry quite well, or you're still navigating an organization, you're in a change role where you're trying to disrupt the status quo, that insecurity can come, right? Wow, I'm new. So I realized that understanding that fear has helped me to, as I said earlier, it's the mindset, it's the thought process that really limits you. It's not so much the environment, it's the way you're thinking about the environment, what you're processing in the environment. And it changed, again, as I say, it totally changes the way I look at situations and I respond in situations. Am I going to have a bad day? Am I going to get triggered and say something and be defensive and want to have the last word? Of course, we have those moments. It's being forgiving of yourself in those moments. And I have found, even in those challenging moments where you don't show up the way you want to, or the person you're interacting with doesn't show up in the way they want to, and emotions get heightened, it's still okay, because I've had enough experiences in my career that, again, you're being authentic in the moment. You're letting people know in the moment that you're not happy with the direction, or maybe you feel like, you're stepping on my toes, or you're trying to take my job. All these things you hear when you're in a role that's driving change in an organization. But getting past that moment of conflict, I have seen more benefit than avoiding the conflict, than swallowing your feelings. So for me, it's that, again, that fearless authenticity, like own how you feel in the moment and create a safe space for others to do the same. I'm not saying be reckless, right? Fearless and reckless are different things. You still want to be respectful. But as I tell people, please, and I've told my team members and my peers, I don't care how inelegantly you say it. Tell me how you feel. And worst case, you'll hurt my feelings. But you know what? I'm going to get over it. I'm not going to hold a grudge. I'm going to get over it. And I have found, as I said, some of my dearest, tightest professional relationships have come through conflict where we've had clashing objectives, but we found our way on the other side of it and made all the difference.
Those relationships where you had a relationship and you had a clash and you had to get around that, how did the relationship emerge on the other side? Was it back to the where it was originally? Did it get hurt, or did it get stronger?
Stronger. I can think of two in particular. Stronger because sometimes interpersonal conflicts at work aren't interpersonal. At least they don't start that way. It typically starts with, maybe you're in different departments and your objective, your team has this objective, your team has another objective. You may not have a common view of what success looks like. You just have different priorities, right? You might represent the core business and your responsibility is to drive success in the core business. Someone else's function might be related to diversifying revenue, bringing new ideas into the system that might disrupt the core business. And sometimes those things don't align. That's the challenge of organizations. Or, as I've seen a few times in my career, there's a major restructuring in an organization. And lots of new leaders are coming in at the same time. And multiple change agendas are clashing with each other. Roles aren't as clear. We spend a lot of time defining the boxes, who's in all the boxes, but we don't always think about what's the interaction between the boxes to get the work done. And so that's going to generate a lot of conflict. But it's not that the people themselves have a problem with each other. It's just those objectives aren't in line. But we don't always have healthy ways or learn what are some healthy ways to navigate those conflicts. In fact, many organizations will think conflict is a bad word. But for me, conflict is a neutral word. And I love it because it can be constructive, it could be destructive. But it's needed and it exists in organizations, whether or not you want to acknowledge it. Conflict exists in organizations. And when you're in a strategy function and an innovation function, you need to generate conflict, healthy conflict, so that you can arrive at decisions on resources and how we're going to invest our time and energy and dollars. If there isn't conflict in that process, and you likely don't have a good strategy, because strategy is all about tough choices and trade-offs. So generate the conflict and be okay. It doesn't have to become interpersonal. And so that's the way I think about it. Now, I have interactions with colleagues. I've had interactions where we don't see eye to eye on that. Conflict isn't healthy in any form, the word itself. But like I say, I think differently about it.
Yeah, your job is to challenge the status quo and to look for new ways of doing things, which a lot of people are going to resist. And naturally, there's, like you said, different people have different goals. And part of the growth in the organization comes from finding a middle ground and being able to go through those conflicts and find the best outcome. And what I found very interesting in what you said was that you actually you look to generate conflict because you know that without healthy conflict, it's impossible to improve decision making and to get to the bottom of decision making. And therefore, it's so crucial, like you said, to find ways to navigate those conflicts to make them positive rather than negative.
Absolutely. And people have different conflict styles. I did a recent exercise with my team, which was, again, another illuminating exercise around how we approach conflict and what do we look to preserve that drives our conflict styles. Goal attainment is one dimension, and then relationship, preserving the relationship. And sometimes we are so goal and task oriented that we don't care about the relationship. And sometimes we're so relationship focused that we don't get things done and we avoid, right? And things swirl, right? Decisions swirl. And my style is more problem solver. So it's high relationship, high task orientation. The downside of that is burnout. So it's making sure that we learn when to acquiesce and we learn when to jump in and try and solve those problems. I may assume that this person has an unhealthy detachment or is highly disengaged because they're not showing up in the same way I am, deal with this issue. But for them, for me, it's more important to preserve the relationship. I'd rather compromise, or I'm not going to embrace a competitive style, or I'm going to avoid because the stakes they're not high enough. It's not as important. So it's okay. It's more important to, as I say, preserve the relationship. So I think discerning when it's important, and then when it's okay to let go. But again, people have different styles. It's adapting to the right context. So no one style is right or wrong. It's making sure that your default style isn't used for every situation, every interaction you encounter. Certainly be downsides to that.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you being high task, high relationship, that your downside is burnout. There was a time in your life where you were doing a full-time MBA, you had a toddler, you were doing part-time work at the same time. I have no idea how you were doing all three things at once, either of those as a full-time job. And so I imagine you were definitely experiencing or close to experiencing burnout. So how have you been able to navigate through that and advocate for what you needed to get the support you needed to do all those things and not burn out?
I think back to that time, and I was also part of a student run dance company. Who knows how I found that time? All of that too. But that helped me because I had an outlet, I had a creative outlet. In undergrad, when I was at Brown, I was such a procrastinator. I'd nap every afternoon, I'd pull all nighters when I had to. Once I became a mom, 1 year old, and I, as you said, full time MBA, part time work, I became so disciplined. I knew the pockets of time in the day when I had to get certain things done. And that helped tremendously. I was in classes with students who weren't employed, didn't have families. They had much more flexibility than I had. So I would assert that these are the things I can do when we would have group projects. I'm not the all-nighter person. So come 9 o'clock, I'm going to do my piece. I'm out of here. I have to get home. So I set boundaries around my time. As I think about self-advocacy too, is single mom wasn't earning a whole lot at the time. I was literally living paycheck to paycheck, because when you think of like daycare costs, rent, all these things, it's a wonder how I did it when I look back on it. But I had just barely missed the cutoff for a merit scholarship for that MBA program that I had been accepted to, and I thought, oh, I'm gonna still ask for it anyway, and I got scholarship funds. So that was where it's like, hey, take a chance, ask for it. And then I got a grant from the Hispanic Scholars Fund as well. And so that paid for half of my MBA education, which that I absolutely needed that. So less debt for me. As I mentioned to you, I'm a learner. One of the things I love learning about and applying in my day-to-day work is around organizational behavior, organizational change, and transformation. Well, there wasn't anything in the curriculum that I saw beyond the organizational behavior courses that I took. So I advocated for a self-independent study around change management, and was able to do. Faculty member supported me in that, and that was a great learning opportunity. As I say, I still feel like I'm a student of organizational transformation. It's a huge passion of mine, and the seed was planted in MBA school. So it's advocate for resources, advocate for time, advocate for the learning environment you want to create, that you're going to thrive in.
What's fascinating is that you, first of all, you had good understanding of yourself in those situations and what you needed, even though the environment around you, the other students, didn't have as much pressure because they didn't have those family commitments. And you ignored the formal rules to some extent by asking for that scholarship, that merit scholarship, even though you had missed out the deadlines. And you got it, which means you probably did a pretty good job in advocating for it, or building a case for it and explaining why you missed the deadline. And you also set your boundaries very clearly. Was that from the very beginning of your interactions with the other students, with your groups?
When the group project started, yes. And I realized I was, depending on the course or in different groups, but I'm thinking of one course in particular where I think I was the only woman, and I was a mom, single mom. And yeah, I said, I got to take charge in this situation. I got to make it clear what I can do and what I can't do. And it worked out. It worked out. They respected it.
Yeah, they respected it. And by sharing it very clearly and openly early on, and you were able then to make sure that people took into account and consideration throughout the projects and activities. And then you advocated for the other part with your professors to do the work on change, organizational change behavior. So yeah, this shows that yes, we can get a lot from a situation, from an opportunity, even in a very constrained situation, if we know what we want and we're able to articulate that to the people and not necessarily give up because timeline expired or anything like that, right? Keep trying. And you also must have advocated for your own career, right? And it seems like you had a few career pivots. Have you had to speak up for those or have any conversations, or how did that happen for you, those career changes?
I'd like to think I've been pretty strategic in my career in the sense that I wanted to chase after learning opportunities. So even when I was very fortunate earlier in my career to have managers that really embraced, what I call side hustles, right, career-wise, where I'm in an organization, I have my core functions, but there are things outside of my span of responsibility. Maybe it's running a task force, special projects, a strategic initiative that the organization's pursuing, and being a part of those efforts. And so that allowed me to, I would say, and what I encourage people to do, to build a personal brand outside of your functional responsibilities. So I became the person who, hey, if there's a problem, just get Lisa in there. She'll figure it out. If she can't figure it out, she'll know who to bring in to figure it out. So that helps me position myself for different roles. And I remember, as I reflected back on my career, realizing that, wow, a lot of my career pivots or changes in roles came after major organizational changes. When there's a major restructuring or leader, sometimes people get really nervous, understandably. Oh my gosh, what's going to happen to my role, my job? And maybe they'll lay low. I guess my view was always, how can I be of service in this change? What are the things I can do to ensure that the leaders that are driving the change know that I have their backs, that I'm going to support it? And there was one change in particular where my job was broadening, and the organizational change created more specialty support services. So I was put in a role, and at the time it was a marketing function. And as much as I enjoyed marketing, I wanted a bigger picture. I felt, oh no, wait, I like operations too, and strategy, I like all these other things. And so I didn't want to go deep. I wanted to go broad at that stage of my career. And I remember I had a relatively new manager at the time, and we were traveling. And I'm still visualizing. So we were traveling to a site of one of our partners, and I can't recall what I said, but she said, wow, you must really love your role. And in that moment, actually, I was hoping to pursue a role in that new department, that strategy department that was created. And not knowing in that moment, she could have said, oh, that's too bad. Tell me more about that. And was so supportive. And look, all these years later, the head of strategy for a major health system. And it was because I spoke up in that moment. I knew I needed to be honest. Sometimes I'm honest with all, but I was honest in that moment that I wanted to do something else. And fortunately for me, and I think it would be the case in most cases, you're going to have a manager, as I had, that supported that transition. And so I encourage people, never be afraid to tell your manager what your aspirations are, even if they're not tied to the job that you're in today. Because of that experience, I try and pay it forward in my own career. And I've had team members tell me, hey, I'd love to work with this team, or I'd like to be in this type of role. And I do everything I can to help them and to be their greatest champion for that. And I even have conversations today. Hey, if this isn't the role, what would be the role that you would find more fulfilling? Because a lot of times there is a misfit, and people aren't comfortable in those situations articulating it. So for me, it's been a blessing to have managers like that, and I want to be that blessing to someone else.
It's fascinating because at the time it was a risky move, because if the answer was no, then your manager would know that you didn't like that work as much, and she might actually remove you from important activities and projects, and in a way hurt a little bit your growth and in career. But you wanted it enough, and still you spoke up and you talked about what you wanted, and it worked out. And what I had never considered was that having gone through those experiences where you did speak up and leaders did respond very positively, and helped you advance your career in the way you wanted changed how you do your own leadership because you were able to have positive examples early on, but because you spoke up and you put yourself in that situation, that you then took that forward and paid it forward in your own leadership. I never made that association. Are there other ways in which you spoke up to advance your career?
I think it's really valuable to let people know what your aspirations are, not just your manager. I think about how so much of my success, as I mentioned earlier, hey, Lisa can jump in, solve the challenge, and bring people together. I was really, really good at leading cross-functional teams. And it got to a point in my career that, wow, I didn't really have people management experience, and I wanted to, and I knew that was going to be an important step in my career, from leading teams as a individual contributor to developing others, managing others. And so I would make a lateral move. I would go for roles, right, where, yeah, that was a requirement, but I had an at bat and I was able to articulate how my experience leading teams as an individual contributor would translate into managing others. I'll say in my earliest roles of being a people manager, I wasn't authentic. And I was fearful because I thought I needed to be the manager, if that made sense, right? So it was the things that I was successful at as an individual contributor, collaboration and connection. It took a back seat to, oh, do I need to be more directive in the way I work with others and the way I lead others? There were definitely some missteps then. Do I need to be like other managers that I see who had perhaps maybe more autocratic styles? And so it was a time where I realized I need to lead the way I want to lead, not like how I think others expect me to or how I think I should. I remember a lot of reflection at that time, and it really helped me. Sometimes our biggest challenges and failures and mistakes teach us so much about how to show up. So I think those experiences really helped me be that caring, supportive, encouraging manager that my team members tell me that I am. And that's, again, a huge blessing to be in a situation where I can lead people from a place of authenticity, helping them on their fearless journeys to being vulnerable and sharing. I have a passion for women in leadership roles and women of color. And so it's for me to be in a position to share my experiences and encourage others. It's not a straight linear path to being a chief or whatever aspiration you have. It's got its twists and turns. And sometimes you're going to make mistakes, but you're going to learn from them, and you're going to learn and grow from them as well. Advocating, learning how to advance your career and advocating for yourself, it's going to take practice. It's going to take time. And I would say persist in that. But make sure you're centered with what you value. So I think it's making sure that you do that inner work first and not chase the things that you think matter, like a title, for example. Don't get so fixated on a title, a salary, a position in an organization, or even a particular organization. Just get centered and grounded on the things that you value and stay true to that.
Yeah, you mentioned quite a few things. One of them was your jump from individual contributor to managing people and how you were able to advocate for that by sharing, talking about your transferable skills and all of that. And it seems like that's how you made that jump, which a lot of people struggle to make that jump. They don't really know how to articulate that in the same role because they don't have the previous experience. And like, why would someone hire me for this role? But you did that quite well. And then the second thing I thought was very interesting was how you learned to be yourself and find your own leadership style that worked for you by making a couple of mistakes in the beginning. Mistakes, not that they were necessarily mistakes, but they felt inauthentic. and being able to do that work. And it seems like you quickly realized that the formula wasn't quite working for you, and that you wanted to find your own management style, leadership style that felt good for you and for your team, obviously, and for others around you. So really,
Well,
really
one of the exercises I did that was really helpful was creating a leadership philosophy. In just a few words, what is their leadership philosophy? And for me, it was developing leaders and not amassing followers. That's where I ended up when I was really reflecting. It's like, oh, okay, if your philosophy is to develop leaders, operate from that place. And that's challenging too, because sometimes I can be too hands off. Oh yeah, you lead, you figure it out. And so I realized sometimes I have to be more hands-on and supportive in helping others through that developmental process that they're going through. But I think, again, this is where it's like that authenticity. What do you want to get out of leadership? What is it? Like, if it's about your own personal ambitions, you're going to be probably not a great leader. But if it's about impact and knowing how you want to make an impact on others, on your organization, then I think you're going to lead from a different place, and you're going to build that trust with others and that fellowship.
what a beautiful definition. Developing leaders and not amassing followers. There's a definition for our listeners. Going into a little bit of some of the traits and things that you have to do in your job, and part of it is asking tough questions. You mentioned earlier you had to, part of your job is to challenge the status quo. So how does that work for you? How did you learn how to ask tough questions? Because a lot of people are actually frightened of asking hard questions because of that quote that you have on your office, which is it going to make people feel, silly or small or insignificant or hurt. So what's your philosophy around that?
I love roles. So for me personally, as I've mentioned a couple of times, this fascination and passion for organizational transformation. And so when you're drawn to those roles and you come into organizations where you're bringing new capabilities, anything new, I want to be a part of, right? A new team, new function. And new doesn't always coexist with the old, right? The history of an organization, the status quo. And for me, it's but there's always some element of the status quo that people in organizations aren't happy with. But figuring out what that is. Sometimes the status quo, people recognize it needs to change, but what the change looks like or what's on the other side of that change is probably what holds people back. So what I did in my current role is you have to listen. When you're new to an organization, listen and learn first to understand what is working in the organization. What are the needs and expectations of your role that you're bringing in to an organization? In my case, it was strategic planning, strategy, and innovation. And to understand what are the needs and expectations of my stakeholders, whether they be board members, team members, colleagues, fellow chiefs, and then to build a narrative, an assessment that wasn't just what I think, it's what I heard. So it's almost like holding up a mirror to an organization and people realizing, oh yeah, I want to change that, or that's not working for us, or we need to get better at this, or we don't do this well enough, or we need to stop doing this, but we don't tend to stop things. Like all the things that you hear when you come into an organization, and you've got to genuinely listen. And as I like to say, don't lead with your chin. Just don't come in with a fix-it mentality. No matter what you're told, I would advise people, no matter what you're told in an interview, do not come in with a fix-it mentality, because it's going to take time for you to figure out what is sacred in an organization and what is subject to change. And you don't always know the difference for a while. You may hear different things, but it's forming your own opinion. I believe very strongly in the 90-day plan, right? Coming in and having a structured approach to understanding the organization. Now you're bringing lots of ideas and experiences from other organizations, and that's valid. That's why this organization that you're in has hired you. Be mindful not to use that as your blueprint, because every organization has its own context, has its own challenges and dynamics, political, personalities, all kind of power dynamics that are really different organization to organization. And if you don't listen, you're not going to be successful. You're not going to pick up on those cues, as we talked about, where it's important to pick up on body language. Organizations have their own language, their own ways of doing things. And I always like to ask when I'm talking with people in different organizations, what are the characteristics of people that are really successful in this organization? What do they have? Again, looking at the norms. Sometimes they're not even spoken out loud. Those norms that people really embrace in an organization. For me, that's what helps to drive, to begin to shift the status quo. Sometimes you need to focus on the gaps that everyone wants to close in an organization before you can tackle those other things that might be more sacred or more challenging to address. And it's a process. It requires, I would say, tremendous resiliency, right? Being able to navigate ambiguity. And as you said, when you're in a role that you're challenging the status quo, you are going to trigger those feelings of those defensive feelings around for incompetence. Hey, you didn't like the way I did it, or you want to do what I'm doing. You want to take over. When that can create a lot of tension. So this is where the conflict piece comes into play. It all feeds together, and people aren't always as vulnerable to share those insecurities that they have, right? They're going to manifest in different ways, being sensitive to that. But I would say that's key, understanding what you can impact and influence first, and then building trust and momentum from there.
Yeah, so you interview a lot of people, understand what the gaps are, what the existing current gaps that people want to solve. You said, I thought it was very visual. You hold up a mirror for all stakeholders to get on the same page and then start from the common pain before you then move on to the things that you want to change that people are going to resist. But by then you've already built some trust, you've already built some connection, and then things become easier.
They can become easier. It could be harder to change, but the relationships can help you navigate it, right? Because if you have trusting relationships, then you can work through the friction, right? That inevitably comes. But how do we get to a place where we're going to assume positive intent, right? And it takes time for people to, when you're new in an organization, for people to assume positive intent, especially if you're coming in a role that maybe didn't exist before, after maybe a period of volatility in an organization. That maybe you're hired by a brand new leader in the organization who's still building their political capital, right? And building trust. And that's what I was mentioning earlier about when you come into organizations where there's a lot of new leaders and a lot of change happening, finding that common ground and that collaboration, right? That easier flow of collaboration, it's going to take time. And I would say just being patient, which is not one of my best qualities, but being patient with the process is key. And surrounding yourself with people who are as passionate about the change and changing the status quo as you are, because that can fill your bucket too in those inevitable days when you're like, oh my goodness, this is really hard.
Yeah, no, I like those tips. Let's say you're in one of those, change situations or any other situation, even a meeting, and you have an opinion about something. Maybe that opinion is something that you're not so sure of, or maybe it's something you predict that others might not like because it's different, it's going to change things. How do you go about that? Have you always shared your thoughts openly, and how do you deal with ideas are not fully formulated just yet?
I think it's so contextual. I love the acronym WAIT. Why am I talking? Where you have to slow down and say, hey, am I adding a point here do I have a large enough stake in the conversation? Do I have the expertise? Am I saying something just because I feel like it's my turn to say something? Am I truly going to contribute to the conversation? For me, when it comes from a place of, so in healthcare as an example, I'm not a clinician. This is my first role in healthcare delivery There's a lot of clinical conversations. I'm not going to get into the clinical weeds. I may ask a question to understand, but knowing the seat that I'm sitting in from a place of the consumer or from the patient, like being their advocate in the conversation, I'll speak up in those moments. There's lots of, as I tell my team, and a lot, that the role of strategist is really to curate insights and orchestrate conversations. We don't own the strategy, but how do we create the conditions and how do we create those conversations, create that space for people to have different points of view, where you can have all the divergent thinking, but you definitely need to have a strong decision-making orientation too, right? So it's like knowing when to gather a lot of voices and then knowing when, you have to make a decision. And so I think it's important to, as you're facilitating these conversations, that just because someone isn't saying something doesn't mean that they're agreeing, doesn't mean that they don't have a point of view or that they're not engaged. It could be that there's just more dominant voices. Could be that there's power dynamics in a meeting that don't encourage more conversation. So I think if people aren't as comfortable, what I call like intellectual sparring, inviting people's opinions, making sure that people are taking turns. So I do think it's important to read a situation and know, okay, am I debating for debate's sake? Is it really because of my own personal pride or my own personal stake in this? Or am I really advancing the conversation so that we can get to a well-informed decision?
I think it's really important, that idea of inviting intellectual sparring, because like you said, a lot of people are going to feel intimidated like you did early on in your career, and people might not know when is the right place for them to speak up. Sometimes they'll feel uncomfortable. There's a power dynamics, like you mentioned. So inviting that, I think, is crucial. And I also like what you said about knowing where you can add value. And in those moments, speaking your mind and sharing your thoughts and knowing when to let someone else run the show and do the talking. That goes back to doing our own homework, right? You did your own homework to understand what your role was there. That's also part of being fearless and authentic in those conversations.
And sometimes the most fearless thing you can do is to say, I don't know. Sometimes we put pressure on ourselves to make a great point or to be the expert. And frankly, I struggled with that. And there's still a part of me where it's, oh boy, I don't know what they're talking about, but not pretending. Last week, we were going through a metric, and we had a couple people on the call that they're data analysts. They got it. They get it. And I wasn't understanding, and I didn't really say anything. And then so this still happens, right? And then someone on the call said, "Hey, Lisa, what do you think?" And I don't really understand. I don't think I could explain it in the way that you explained it. So I'm guessing I'm not really understanding. And then it became more clear, and then it invited more conversations. I realized, see, there you go. Don't do it. Don't hold yourself back. Don't not say in that moment that you don't quite understand what that number means or what that metric means. More often than not, someone else has that same question. Hey, I'm still a work in progress some days.
Yeah, and especially if you show up to a new organization or you're dealing with a whole new area or a whole new team, you're not expected to know everything. And there's a lot of jargon in teams and companies that people are throwing around, and it's sometimes we just don't know, and it's best to ask. There's nothing shameful in asking for clarification.
That's right. Absolutely.
And when it comes to disagreement, and again, we've been talking about conflict and how you see conflict as a necessary step for decision making, for effective decision making and growth and advancement. How do you disagree and express conflicting views in a way that gets positive results and moves towards those positive decisions? And also, have you experienced any skepticism, and how have you handled that?
As I think about conflict really not being a negative thing, right? It's just difference. It's difference. whether it's different expectations or different goals or different outcomes, even different biases that we bring into situations. For me, it's I want to know. I want to know in those moments that someone has a difference of opinion, because I know I'll learn from that. But again, being a learner, that's something that I'm certainly open to. Have someone change my mind, have a different point of view. In those moments where if I am triggered and feeling incompetent, I may not be as generous in those moments of disagreement. And it's pausing and being self-aware in those moments that, ooh, I'm coming from a place of wanting to be preserving my sense of ego. That takes a lot of self-awareness and introspection around that. So it's that knowing yourself and knowing what might trigger that defensiveness or these reactions instead of a more measured response. But as I said, I would much prefer someone to be more transparent about that, about their difference, even their skepticism. There's a lot of skepticism in innovation, right? There's fear of failure. There's a lot of, as much as organizations want to pursue innovation and create innovative cultures, we do not like to fail. We want certainty, as I like to say, we want certainty and we want success. But that's not guaranteed anywhere, right? But there's so much on the line when it comes to innovation, right? So it's like this gap between this aspiration to be innovative, but the tenacity to fight through the doubt, the fears of failure, the experimentation. It's a very different way of thinking and functioning in an organization. And it's hard to get right. It's hard to get right. And as I tell my team, our innovation function is an experiment in and of itself. We're still learning. We're students of innovation, and we're going to figure it out. I think the key is understanding what innovation means to your organization. There's no perfect, in my view, no perfect definition. It's just what it means in the context of your organization. What are those problems and challenges you want to be able to solve in new ways? And how can you create a culture of experimentation where it's okay to try different things and learn from it? I know the cliche, right? Fail fast, fail cheap. When I'm thinking, learn fast. Learn as quickly as you can. Create the conditions to create a hypothesis about what you think your consumer, in our case, patients, need. What are those unmet needs that they have, and how can we meet those needs in really interesting ways, unique ways that don't create more burden to the clinical staff, to the physicians. And so that's a really tough balance. But there's a lot of challenges in healthcare, which means it's ripe for a lot of innovation. But you got to fight through the doubt, the skepticism. There'll be naysayers in the organization. There'll be people scratching their heads. You paid how much for what? And I've been in multiple situations where I had to face that skepticism and not get rattled by it, understand it, and not get rattled by it.
Yeah, and in many ways, you and your team are shaping what that innovation function looks like. You're probably asking the question and at the same time influencing how it's being shaped in the organization and testing things out, because you have to influence not only your stakeholders above you and laterally, but also teams that are outside of your team, because strategy impacts the entire organization. And that's really hard. It's much easier to just create change in your team, but your role is company wide. So there can be naysayers and resistance coming from any and all directions.
Absolutely. We think so much about silos in organizations. You probably hear that a lot. I hear it a lot. We have so many silos, and there's probably many reasons for it, but for me, silos make sense when you think about what you were just describing, is that it's really hard to work across organizational boundaries. It's easier. It may not be in the organization's best interest, but it can be easier for groups to operate in their silos. I know what I need to get done. Remember, you want certainty and you want success. I know what my job is. I know what I signed up for, and I know what my manager wants me to do, and their manager. But taking the time, I think the work of leadership is understanding how do we put the organization's best interest and the mission of the organization ahead of my own functional leadership interests and ambitions. And that's hard. That's really hard to do, but that's where that really knowing yourself and knowing, yeah, it's okay to be ambitious. Again, like conflict, ambitious is not a bad thing. It's sometimes you just have to put your personal ambitions aside for the good of the organization, for the strategic direction it wants to go into. And it's in those moments where, as I mentioned earlier in my career, I realized, okay, my role might need to change. I might need to be in a new role. I might need to adapt to this role I've been given to ensure that I'm in support of the direction of the organization. And when you're in organizations with highly tenured people, that's something that everyone in and of themselves has to think about. Do I preserve the silo at the expense of moving the organization forward? And as challenging as those situations are, it's what I love to be a part of in organizations, helping to navigate those conversations and having people be vulnerable in those moments. Because even if you're not speaking it out loud, change comes with those fears of insignificance, incompetence, and unlikability. So it's how do I honor that, understand it, and still try and move the organization forward.
Yeah, yeah, those are key. And it's wonderful that you like it and embrace it. We need more people like that in organizations who embrace the change and those challenges of navigating those difficult conversations or conflict that most people don't like. Now, when it comes to your team, what qualities do you look for?
For me, it's trustworthiness is high on my list. A lot of leaders, if you don't create trust and build these trusting relationships, it's going to be really challenging to get a lot accomplished. Creativity is big. Are you excited about solving problems? Being a team player, so working with teams, do you get energized by working as a team where you bring in different strengths to solve problems, to transform an organization, right? To really make an impact. So collaboration is key. Curiosity is key too. So not feeling like you have to have all the answers. You don't have to show up as the expert. Be open to learning. Create environments where people can learn from each other. I would say comfort with ambiguity is important for someone in a strategy and innovation function. It's such a dynamic world that we're in. Doesn't matter what industry you're in. There's so much change, so much volatility, and being okay with that and not feeling like there is this fixed set future for an organization. It's much more fluid than that. And so understanding that and being energized by that. And we've been talking about fearless authenticity. So having courage, having courage and showing up with your full self in a way that bridges relationships and drives connection. Because I love to have fun at work. And as I said, I'd like to be in environments where we just have deep personal connections too, and we laugh and we just generally care about each other. I think that just teams flourish with those characteristics in my mind. At least those have been the most positive team experiences I've had that had some of those characteristics in team members.
Curiosity, courage, and comfort with ambiguity. I think they go together to some extent. I think and collaboration, obviously, I think those things work well together. Mm-hmm. One of the things that you mentioned was the concept of intellectual sparring. And you have mentioned before that you love debates. Some people don't like debates. So for you, what's the purpose of debate and how do you engage in it?
So I think of it as, because the term debate could be, hey, your opinion versus my opinion and one wins. If it's dialogue, two people coming together or a whole group of people coming together to share different perspectives. I think of inclusive leadership requires creating an environment where people with differences of opinion or different life experiences I grew up one way, you grew up another way, so I'm going to have a different view of the world. Doesn't make one right or wrong. But it can feel that way when you're in an environment where there aren't many people that have that same lived experience that you do, maybe not look like you do. So I try and be sensitive to those situations as well. And that's where the advocating perhaps for those voices that aren't in the room, I think is important as well. And acknowledging my own blind spots. We all have them. I even know what they are. That's why they call it blind spots. But there's things that I don't know. There's experiences that I haven't had. But I want to make sure that those experiences that I have that shape a particular interaction, that I can bring that to the table. I think about, and I've had friends, we've had this conversation about dynamics in conference rooms. And I'm recalling an incident where I was the only woman in a conference room of all men who in very technical data roles. And I don't even remember what the topic was, but I'm visualizing the room that we were in, and they all introduced themselves to one another and ignored me. And they started the meeting. This is weird. And so I paused. I said, excuse me. And I said my name and then the role and essentially why I was there. And it startled them a little bit. But and it was awkward, but I was so glad that I did it because, again, you're going to have a conversation. I belong in this room. I have a point of view. And I'm going to introduce myself. I have every right to sit in the same conference room as everyone else. In those early years when I was much more intimidated, and occasionally now, that mindset of, do I belong here? Do I belong in this room? Do I belong in this conversation, in this debate? That can hold us back. But take up that space, you belong. But you also have to create that sense of belonging, I would say, in others as well, in those debates where someone in that room is going to have something really enlightening to say that's going to advance the conversation. Let's make sure we hear from them.
I love that story because you made yourself seen, and because of that, people probably paid more attention to what you had to say, and therefore you were able to have a greater impact in that meeting, in that board meeting. When it comes to reading nonverbals, so you mentioned previously when you're talking about entering in your organization and trying to bring change, that it was important to read almost as if reading the nonverbals of the organization. And you talked about being sensitive as well to people and their vulnerabilities, their fears. How does that play out? How do you use that? How do you read nonverbals in the room, and how do you use that to better communicate or to adapt your communication?
One thing I do is try not to over rely on PowerPoints, making sure that it's about building that connection with the audience or who I'm having a conversation with, and not so much what I know, what are my own personal communication objectives. And I was so blessed early in my career to get feedback about not using PowerPoints as a crutch and not having every point I'm going to make on a bullet and reading those bullets bullet by bullet, because I was more fixated on that. If I probably looked up and looked around, I'd probably realize, oh my gosh, these people are probably thinking, I can read that myself. What is she doing? And later in my career saying, hey, you may have a set of slides, you may have 30 minutes allotted, but be prepared, depending on how the meeting goes, to deliver a 5-minute version of what you just created. And so I learned that too. Okay, headlines. What are my headlines? And thinking about who might be in the audience and what their concerns might be. And so sometimes the best meetings are the ones you have before the meeting, right? Where you're anticipating what those triggers might be, or the concerns that might be raised, and what might derail a decision or a conversation. Or you want to make sure you don't go in with blind spots. It's like understanding what are the dynamics that you might be facing in that conversation. But then in the moment, the less you rely on your presentation material and the more you spend looking at people in the eye, even calling them out in the sense of, hey, I know we talked about this last week, or I know that you have a concern about this, drawing your audience in to the conversation, as opposed to more of a one-way more of a one-way update or a dialogue. I think that helps you to not only read body language, but it also helps for people to feel like they're having a conversation with you and they can chime in as well. So it took me time. I used to be terrified of presenting, and realizing that it's not about me, it's about the audience. It's about sharing information. It's about building a connection. And I think that helps. Am I fearless every time I present? No way. There's still times where you still get the butterflies before, but it helps to know that you're there to make a connection, and it's not all about you.
So you walk in thinking about the connection. And I really like the tip of engaging others by asking questions or connecting the dots to the presentation, because often these meetings are one-sided and everyone is quiet and doesn't say a word, and then they just want to leave, and you don't get that interesting conversation back and forth feedback that you are looking for. And I also agree with you that being present, not just looking back and reading the PowerPoint, allows you to better see what's going on and how people are responding to each point you make, so that you can actually know what's working, what's resonating, what's not, and when to ask more questions to the audience, like those two examples that you gave. There's so many tips here. If we were to write out all of the lessons learned from this conversation, it would be a very long list. I'll make sure I write some of these later in the description box or in an accompanying article. Do you have any final thoughts for our listeners today when it comes to authentic, fearless conversations to not only advance your career, but advance the organization, advance your team?
You can overcome your intimidation. I would say that's a key point, because you have the power to shift those thoughts, right? Those thoughts that are triggering that sense of intimidation. Don't be afraid to propose new roles for yourself. Understand what you value, the kinds of contributions you want to be able to make in an organization, the value you believe you bring to an organization, and don't be afraid to, even if it's a side hustle in your current role, right, to pursue those things that are going to really fill your bucket. I would say embrace constructive conflict, and certainly differentiate between fearlessness and recklessness, but embrace it and know that people have different conflict styles. Know your own and get comfortable with debate. And I would say lastly, manage your resilience, because if you're in a role that's requiring you to challenge the status quo, make sure you have those outlets, whether it's community of practitioners or colleagues, mentors, people that have been in similar situations or going through the same thing. I would highly recommend joining professional networking groups. Create those communities where you can share experiences, ideas, and build one another up. And it sounds like your podcast is also a wonderful opportunity to learn from many other leaders about how to manage your resilience while you're speaking up for yourself, for your organization, for others.
Beautiful, beautifully said. And it's very much possible to speak up and add value and do so in a respectful way, while at the same time encouraging others to share their voice and their thoughts and add value in their unique ways, like you do, Lisa, you encourage your team to do. And it's what I really like about what you shared as well is your role is not easy. You have to challenge people. You have to embrace conflict and challenge the status quo and get people on the same page. It's very much possible to do that while being a wonderful person. Right? Clearly, you want to support, help the organization, help the patients, help the team. So when you are able to balance those two sides, and you can be a kind, giving person that's actually doing a lot of good and connecting with individuals, and at the same time speak up and share your thoughts and share your ideas and contribute to the conversation. This conversation with you illustrated just that. So thank you so much, Lisa.
Thank you.